In December of 1944, as Europe shivered under one of the harshest winters in memory, General Omar Bradley sat staring at a map that refused to make sense. The red and blue lines that marked American and German positions had blurred into chaos. Roads disappeared under snow. Forests swallowed entire divisions. Radio reports arrived late, incomplete, or not at all. And in the middle of that confusion lay a nightmare Bradley had feared for months: an American army, stretched too thin, too confident, and now dangerously exposed. For Bradley, this was not just a tactical problem. It was the moment he had privately dreaded, the moment when everything he feared about overextension, arrogance, and underestimating the enemy seemed to be coming true all at once. Bradley had never been a man who loved drama. Unlike his flamboyant subordinate George S. Patton, Bradley believed wars were won through discipline, coordination, and quiet competence. He trusted careful planning more than bold gestures, logistics more than speeches, and steady pressure more than lightning strikes. And yet, in the days leading up to the German offensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, Bradley felt something he rarely allowed himself to feel: unease. A gnawing sense that the Allied front, so proudly stretched across Europe, had become dangerously fragile. He feared that if the Germans struck hard and fast, the American lines would bend, then break. And if that happened, the consequences would be catastrophic. The Ardennes forest had been considered a quiet sector, a place to rest tired divisions and rebuild strength. Bradley himself had accepted this assumption, though not without reservations. He knew the terrain favored surprise. He knew the weather limited Allied air power. And he knew that Adolf Hitler, cornered and desperate, was capable of reckless gambles. But even knowing all this, Bradley did not fully believe the Germans could mount a major offensive, not because they lacked the will, but because he believed they lacked the strength. That belief would soon be tested in the most brutal way imaginable. When the German attack finally came on December 16th, it came with a ferocity that shocked everyone. Artillery thundered through the fog. Panzer divisions surged through snow-covered roads. American units, some newly arrived and poorly equipped for winter warfare, were caught off guard. Communications collapsed. Entire regiments were surrounded. And as reports poured in, Bradley's worst fear began to crystallize. Not merely that the front would be pierced, but that the American command structure itself might unravel under pressure. He feared confusion, hesitation, and conflicting decisions at the worst possible moment. Bradley feared something else too, something far more personal. He feared that George Patton, the man he both admired and distrusted, would either be too slow to respond or too reckless in doing so. Patton was brilliant, there was no denying that. But he was also impulsive, ego-driven, and prone to dramatic gestures that could either save an army or destroy one. Bradley worried that in a crisis of this magnitude, Patton might finally go too far. Or worse, that he might not move fast enough at all. The situation at Bastogne became the symbol of everything Bradley feared. The town sat at a critical crossroads, and when the 101st Airborne Division was surrounded there, it represented more than just trapped soldiers. It represented the potential collapse of the entire northern shoulder of the Allied front. Bradley feared that Bastogne would fall. He feared the Germans would seize the crossroads, roll westward, and split Allied forces in two. He feared that months of hard-won progress would be undone in a matter of days. And deep down, he feared history would remember this moment as the one where Allied overconfidence met its punishment. Inside Bradley's headquarters, tension was thick. Officers spoke in hushed tones. Every new report felt worse than the last. Supply shortages mounted. Fuel ran dangerously low. The weather refused to clear. Bradley feared that without air support, American forces would be blind and vulnerable. He feared that morale would crack under the cold, hunger, and constant pressure. And above all, he feared that the Germans, underestimated and written off, were proving they still had enough fight left to change the course of the war. It was in this atmosphere of fear and uncertainty that Bradley made one of the most difficult decisions of his career, turning to Patton and asking him to do the unthinkable. Patton was already engaged in operations to the south, redirecting his Third Army northward in the dead of winter. Through icy roads and enemy resistance seemed nearly impossible. Bradley feared that asking Patton to pivot so quickly would lead to disaster. He feared logistical collapse, traffic jams, broken supply lines, and exposed flanks. He feared Patton's confidence might exceed reality. And yet, what Bradley feared even more was doing nothing. When Bradley asked Patton how long it would take him to turn his army north and relieve Bastogne, he expected a cautious answer. Days, perhaps weeks. Instead, Patton responded with an almost casual confidence that bordered on arrogance. He said he could attack in 3 days. To Bradley, this sounded insane. He feared Patton was bluffing, or worse, delusional. Moving an entire army, men, tanks, artillery, fuel, food, across frozen terrain under combat conditions in such a short time defied conventional military logic. Bradley feared that Patton's promise would end in failure and humiliation. But what Bradley did not say out loud, what he kept buried beneath his calm exterior, was a deeper fear that if Patton failed, there would be no backup plan. Bastogne would fall, the Germans would surge forward, and Bradley himself would bear responsibility for one of the greatest Allied setbacks of the war. History would not forgive excuses. It would only remember outcomes. As Patton began issuing orders, Bradley watched closely. He expected chaos. He expected confusion. He expected delays. But instead, something extraordinary began to happen. Patton's staff moved with precision. Units pivoted as if rehearsed. Engineers cleared roads. Logistics officers worked around the clock. What Bradley had feared would be impossible was unfolding with alarming speed. And yet, even as things moved, Bradley remained cautious. He had seen plans unravel before. He knew war had a way of punishing confidence. The weather remained brutal. Snowstorms battered convoys. Vehicles broke down. Soldiers froze. And still, the Third Army moved. Bradley feared that the Germans, sensing the movement, would strike Patton's exposed flanks. He feared ambushes, counterattacks, and catastrophic losses. He feared Patton was gambling everything on speed. But Patton seemed unshaken. To him, hesitation was the real enemy. As days passed, Bradley's fear slowly transformed into something unfamiliar: hope. Reports from the front suggested Patton was ahead of schedule. His spearheads were pushing north. German resistance was fierce, but not decisive. Bradley feared to believe it at first. He had learned the hard way that premature optimism could be dangerous. But the facts were undeniable. Patton was doing what Bradley feared no one could do. Behind closed doors, Bradley reflected on his own assumptions. He had feared boldness. He had feared speed. He had feared trusting a man whose style clashed so sharply with his own. And now, that very boldness was becoming the Allies' lifeline. The relief of Bastogne was no longer a distant hope. It was becoming a real possibility. Bradley feared what it meant for his own legacy as much as he feared the battle itself. If Patton succeeded, history would remember not just Patton's brilliance, but Bradley's hesitation. As Patton's forces closed in on Bastogne, Bradley understood that he had been standing at the edge of one of the most important lessons of the war. Leadership was not about being right all the time. It was about knowing when to let someone else be right instead. And in that frozen December, as American soldiers fought through snow and steel, Bradley watched his greatest fears slowly unravel, not into disaster, but into one of the most remarkable turnarounds in military history. Yet the battle was far from over. The Germans would not give up easily. Bastogne was still surrounded. Men were still dying. Supplies were still scarce. And Bradley feared that even if Patton broke through, the cost might be unbearable. Victory, he knew, often came wrapped in tragedy. And as he waited for the final outcome, Bradley braced himself for whatever history was about to deliver. As Patton's Third Army pushed north through the frozen roads of Luxembourg and Belgium, General Omar Bradley felt a tension unlike anything he had experienced before in the war. This was not the tension of an impending attack or the fear of enemy fire. This was a deeper, quieter tension, the fear of watching events unfold beyond his control. Bradley had built his career on careful calculation, on maintaining balance between aggression and restraint. Now, that balance was gone. The situation was moving too fast, and for the first time, Bradley could only watch and wait. Each hour brought new reports, and each report carried the weight of lives hanging in the balance. Patton's armored columns were advancing, but the Germans were not retreating quietly. Roadblocks appeared suddenly. Panzer units struck from concealed positions. Bridges were blown just as American forces reached them. Bradley feared that Patton's momentum would slow, then stall. He feared that the weather, the enemy, and the sheer strain of logistics would finally catch up. And if that happened, Bastogne would remain isolated, and the men inside would pay the price. Inside Bastogne, the situation was growing desperate. The 101st Airborne and attached units were encircled, low on ammunition, food, and medical supplies. Wounded men lay in makeshift aid stations without adequate care. The cold seeped into bones and minds alike. German artillery pounded the town relentlessly, day and night. Bradley feared that even if Patton reached the outskirts, it might be too late. He feared that relief arriving a day too late would be remembered not as salvation, but as tragedy narrowly missed. Bradley's fear was not abstract. He knew the men in Bastogne were not symbols on a map. They were soldiers with families, with hopes of returning home. The weight of command pressed down on him, heavier than any previous campaign. He feared that history would ask why he had allowed such a vulnerable position to exist in the first place. He feared that critics would say the Allies had grown complacent, that arrogance had replaced caution. And yet, as Patton's advance continued, something unexpected began to happen. German resistance, though fierce, was disorganized. Fuel shortages plagued German armor. Their grand offensive, so shocking in its opening days, was already beginning to strain under its own ambition. Bradley had feared the Germans were stronger than intelligence suggested, but now he saw the other side of the truth. They had gambled everything on speed and surprise. And once that momentum slowed, cracks appeared everywhere. Patton sensed it. Where Bradley hesitated, Patton pushed harder. Where others saw danger, Patton saw opportunity. His orders were relentless, his demands uncompromising. Men were exhausted, vehicles battered, but the advance did not stop. Bradley feared that Patton's pace would break his own army before it broke the enemy. He feared mutiny, collapse, or catastrophic overextension. But instead, morale surged. Soldiers believed they were part of something decisive. They believed speed itself was their shield. As Christmas approached, the irony was not lost on Bradley. While the world thought of peace and celebration, tens of thousands of men were locked in one of the coldest, bloodiest struggles of the war. Bradley feared that public morale back home would shatter if Bastogne fell. He feared headlines that would erase years of Allied progress. He feared that families would wake to news that their sons had been abandoned. Then came the moment that began to change everything. Patton's lead elements made contact with German forces south of Bastogne. It was not a clean breakthrough. It was brutal, grinding combat through forests, villages, and narrow roads choked with snow. German defenders fought with desperation, knowing that if Patton broke through, their entire offensive would unravel. Bradley followed each development obsessively. He feared false optimism. He feared misreported successes. But as hours turned into days, one fact became undeniable. Patton was closing in. Inside Bradley's headquarters, the atmosphere shifted. The tension remained, but it was no longer paralyzing. It was focused. Officers began speaking with cautious confidence. Maps were updated more frequently. Bradley found himself standing longer over the situation boards, no longer dreading what he might see, but anticipating it. This frightened him in a different way. He feared hope almost as much as despair, because hope made failure feel sharper. On December 26, 1944, Patton's forces finally broke through to Bastogne. When the message arrived confirming contact with the 101st Airborne, Bradley did not celebrate immediately. He sat silently, absorbing the reality of what had just happened. The relief of Bastogne was more than a tactical success. It was a psychological turning point. Bradley felt a wave of emotions he had not expected: relief, gratitude, admiration, and something dangerously close to humility. The thing he had feared most, Patton's audacity, had saved the day. But relief did not erase Bradley's inner conflict. He now faced a different fear: that Patton's success would overshadow the collective effort of countless others, that history would simplify a complex battle into a single heroic narrative. Bradley feared that nuance would be lost, that the careful planning, the sacrifices of ordinary soldiers, and the lessons of restraint would be forgotten in favor of bold headlines and larger-than-life personalities. Even so, Bradley could not deny what his eyes and reports told him. Patton had done the impossible. He had turned an entire army in the dead of winter, under enemy pressure, and struck with precision. The gamble had paid off. Bradley feared what it said about his own instincts. Had he been too cautious? Had his fear of failure nearly prevented success? In the days following the relief of Bastogne, the battle did not simply end. Fighting continued as Allied forces worked to push the Germans back and straighten the bulge in the line. Bradley feared complacency now more than ever. He knew the enemy was wounded but not defeated. Patton, energized by success, wanted to keep pressing. Bradley worried that momentum might turn into recklessness. The old tension between them returned, but it was different now. It was tempered by mutual respect forged in crisis. Privately, Bradley reflected on the nature of leadership. He had feared that trusting Patton would cost him everything. Instead, not trusting him fully might have cost even more. Bradley realized that leadership was not about imposing one's own style on every situation. It was about recognizing when a different approach was needed and having the courage to allow it. Bradley also feared the judgment of history. He knew memoirs would be written, reputations shaped, and narratives fixed. He feared that his doubts would be portrayed as weakness. But deep down, he understood something few would ever admit. That fear itself was not the enemy. Blindness was. Fear forced him to question assumptions, to prepare contingencies, to recognize risk. Patton's fearlessness complemented that in ways neither men fully understood at the time. As winter dragged on, the German offensive collapsed under relentless Allied pressure. Fuel shortages, air superiority once the weather cleared, and mounting casualties sealed their fate. Bradley watched as the bulge was slowly erased from the map. Each mile regained felt like a reaffirmation of Allied resilience. Yet Bradley never forgot how close it had come to disaster. He feared future commanders might forget too. The relief of Bastogne became legend. Patton's name was forever linked to it. But in Bradley's private thoughts, the true lesson lay elsewhere. It lay in the moment when fear met trust, when caution yielded to boldness, and when leadership required letting go. Bradley feared that lesson would be misunderstood or ignored, but he carried it with him for the rest of the war. And still, one final reckoning remained. Because proving Bradley wrong on the battlefield was one thing. Proving him wrong in history, in memory, and in legacy would take much longer. And as the war moved toward its final, brutal months, Bradley knew that the story of Patton, Bastogne, and the fear that preceded it was far from finished. As the winter of 1944 slowly loosened its grip on Europe, General Omar Bradley found himself thinking less about victory and more about consequence. The Battle of the Bulge had ended. The German offensive had failed. The front lines had been restored. On paper, it was a triumph. But Bradley knew wars were not truly measured in territory regained or enemy losses alone. They were measured in decisions, moments where fear, judgment, and responsibility collided. And for Bradley, no decision weighed heavier than the one involving George S. Patton. In the quiet moments after the guns fell silent around Bastogne, Bradley reflected on what he had feared most before the battle began. He had feared collapse. He had feared humiliation. He had feared being remembered as the general who misread the enemy's last gamble. But above all, he had feared trusting a man whose style contradicted everything Bradley believed about command. That fear had been real. It had been rational, and yet it had been wrong. Bradley did not suddenly transform into a man who admired recklessness. He did not become a disciple of Patton's philosophy, but he did something far more difficult. He acknowledged, privately and honestly, that Patton's instincts had been exactly what the moment required. The war had reached a point where caution alone could no longer carry the day. Speed, audacity, and relentless pressure were necessary, even if they frightened those responsible for holding the entire front together. Bradley understood that history would simplify what had happened. It would reduce the Battle of the Bulge to dramatic headlines and iconic moments. Patton's rapid pivot, the relief of Bastogne, the defiant stand of the 101st Airborne. But Bradley knew the truth lived in the spaces between those moments. It lived in sleepless nights, in hesitant orders, in the fear of making the wrong call when every option carried risk. And it lived in the realization that leadership sometimes meant stepping aside and letting someone else take the lead. In later years, Bradley would speak carefully about Patton. Publicly, he maintained a balanced tone, acknowledging Patton's brilliance while emphasizing discipline and teamwork. But in private conversations and writings, Bradley admitted something far more revealing. He admitted that Patton had saved the situation at a time when conventional thinking might have failed. He admitted that without Patton's speed, Bastogne might have fallen. And if Bastogne had fallen, the German offensive could have stretched the war longer, costing countless more lives. That admission did not come easily. Bradley was not a man who enjoyed being proven wrong, but he was a man who valued results over pride. And the results were undeniable. Patton's actions had shortened the crisis. They had restored momentum. They had shattered the illusion that the German army still possessed the strength to dictate the course of the war. Bradley feared that acknowledging this truth might diminish his own role. Instead, it strengthened his legacy as a leader capable of learning under fire. The contrast between Bradley and Patton became one of the defining stories of American command in World War II. Bradley represented restraint, coordination, and careful planning. Patton represented speed, aggression, and instinct. Neither approach was universally superior. What the Battle of the Bulge revealed was that victory often depended on knowing when to use each. Bradley feared rigidity. Patton feared hesitation. And in that winter of 1944, those opposing fears collided and balanced each other. As the Allies pushed eastward into Germany, Bradley carried the lessons of Bastogne with him. He became more open to calculated risks, more willing to trust bold subordinates when circumstances demanded it. He did not abandon his principles, but he refined them. Fear, he realized, was not something to suppress entirely. It was something to listen to, but not obey blindly. Patton, for his part, never stopped being Patton. He continued to push hard, speak bluntly, and challenge conventions. But even he seemed altered by the experience. The relief of Bastogne became one of the proudest moments of his career, not because it glorified him, but because it validated his belief that speed and decisiveness could save lives. Beneath the bravado, Patton understood that his gamble had worked, but it had also depended on others trusting him when trust was difficult. Bradley feared that future generations would misunderstand this dynamic, that they would frame the story as one man right and the other wrong. But the truth was more complex. Bradley's fear had prevented reckless overconfidence before the battle. Patton's boldness had prevented paralysis during it. Together, they represented the full spectrum of effective leadership under extreme pressure. In the years after the war, as memoirs were written and reputations cemented, Bradley watched as Patton's legend grew larger than life. He did not resent it. He understood why people were drawn to Patton's personality and dramatic flair. But Bradley also knew that legends often obscure the quiet truths. The truth that Patton needed a system to operate within. The truth that bold action required someone else to manage the risks it created. And the truth that fear, when acknowledged honestly, could sharpen judgment rather than dull it. Bradley's greatest fear before Patton proved him wrong was not that Patton would fail. It was that Patton would succeed in a way that made Bradley's caution seem unnecessary. And in some ways, that fear came true. But Bradley came to understand that being proven wrong was not a defeat, it was a gift. It meant lives were saved. It meant the war moved closer to its end. It meant leadership had worked as it should. The Battle of the Bulge became the last major German offensive of the war. After its failure, the German army never regained the initiative. Allied forces crossed the Rhine, advanced into the heart of Germany, and brought the war in Europe to a close within months. Bradley knew that the decisions made in December 1944 had shaped that outcome, and he knew that fear, properly confronted, had played a crucial role. In his later reflections, Bradley did not speak of fear with shame. He spoke of it with respect. Fear had warned him of danger. It had forced him to question assumptions. And ultimately, it had guided him toward trusting a man who saw the battlefield differently. That trust, born of fear rather than confidence, had changed the course of history. Patton died not long after the war, before he could fully shape his own legacy. Bradley lived longer, watching the world reinterpret their story through books, films, and popular memory. He rarely corrected the record, but those who knew him understood that behind his calm demeanor was a man who had faced one of the hardest truths a leader can face, that sometimes the thing you fear most is exactly what you need. the story of what General Bradley feared before Patton proved him wrong is not just a story about World War II. It is a story about leadership, humility, and the courage to accept uncomfortable truths. It is a reminder that victory often comes not from certainty, but from the willingness to adapt when certainty fails. And in that frozen winter, when the fate of the Allied front hung by a thread, fear did not destroy American command. It refined it. And because of that, thousands of soldiers lived to see the war's end, return home, and tell the story of how two very different generals, bound by fear, trust, and responsibility, helped change the course of history.